Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Black Sheep Tribune podcast. My name is Teague Gideon, and I am your host. And here I talk about true crime stories that you may have never heard of because everyone's story matters. Before I get started on today's episode, I just want to say that I hope everyone out there listening is doing all right, and I hope that you are staying safe, staying inside as much as possible during this difficult time for all of us. And I hope this podcast episode can be a little getaway for you. Just to get your mind off things for a little bit. So on today's episode, I am finally going to be covering the Jayda Kyle case. I am very, very excited to finally be covering this case here on the podcast. I think I have mentioned her name on every single episode before this one, and I'm finally sitting down to talk about it. I originally was going to cover a different case this month. I was just going to go in order from the cases that I started covering on my blog. But after I released the blog post about Jayda Kyle, I thought it was more important to go ahead and cover her case on the podcast now, rather than put her in the queue, so to speak, and cover the case months later. Speaking of the blog post, I want to say that I am completely overwhelmed by the response that the blog post got. I just want to say thank you so much to anybody who shared it, anybody who read it, liked it, left a comment on it, anything. Just thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of every single one of you. I'm just so happy that it reached so many people and so many people read it and everything. It just really makes me feel like I'm doing my job, so to speak, or I'm doing what I came here to do. Because that's why I started the blog and the podcast, was to circulate stories that I felt like aren't getting the appropriate attention paid to them, and bring attention to them, because you won't hear about them in your main media sources, your big media sources. And just because they're not covered in those big main media sources doesn't mean they're not important. So I feel like that's why I created this. I feel like we needed a place for cases like this that aren't widely publicized and may just be more locally publicized. Okay, so this story starts on November 27th, 2017. Like I said, Jayda Kyle, she was a 3-year-old girl, and she was found unconscious on the floor in her bedroom. After this, she was taken to Mercy Hospital in Joplin, Missouri, and then she was airlifted to Mercy Children's Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Unfortunately, she ended up dying there 4 days later. The forensic evidence collected by the police shows that something traumatic had to have happened to Jayda that night to cause her death, and there's been a lot of controversy around what happened to Jayda and who could have done it to her. At the time that this happened, she was living with her mother, Devin Kyle, her mother's boyfriend, Jaylen Vaden, her brother, Quincy, and Jaylen's child from a previous relationship. Okay, so the first thing that I want to discuss as far as evidence goes in this case are the two biggest pieces of evidence that I felt like I had, which are Devin Kyle's interrogation and Jaylen Vaden's interrogation. So first, I want to talk about the similarities in their interrogations as far as the basic story of what they say happened that night, and then I'll get into the differences in each. The reason why I think it's important to cover the similarities in their interrogations, or I guess really more in their stories of what they say happened that night, is because the main components of what they say happened that night, they agree on, which I think is odd. I would think that usually they would agree to a point. The stories would be same to a point, but if one of them did something to her or heard the other do something to her, I feel like the story would have to differ at some point, but it never really does. So I think it's important to go over those main components that they do agree on, or they do say happened that night. So here's a basic synopsis of what they say happened that night. They say they went to the kids' school for their Christmas program. They completed all the activities. They had little snacks or even a little dinner type thing there. And then they say they all went home and got the kids in the bathtub and then in bed. And then they both say that Jaylen was the one that actually physically tucked them in and was the last one to see them that night. Then they say Jaylen started doing laundry when he went to go check in on Jayda just to make sure she was okay. He then came running into their bedroom holding her. They then called 911 and Jaylen performed CPR on her. Okay, so here's where I want to get into the differences in their interrogations. So these will be differences not only in their story of what they say happened that night or like little things that they added or something, but also like differences in how they were treated and like the questions they were asked and things like that. So the first thing that I want to point out about Devin's interrogation is that she says that she was the one that actually put Jayda in pajamas that night. She also describes Jaylen as a loving father figure that has shown no indication that he did this to Jayda, but she also says that she wouldn't say that he didn't have time to do it because they weren't in the same room all that whole time that night. And then she goes on to say that if anything did happen, that she didn't know anything about it and she didn't hear it. So this is obviously one of the big things that the detective gives her some pushback on, because he doesn't understand how if someone did something to your child to where they physically hurt them in your home, how did you not hear that? And then the other thing that he gives her some pushback on or kind of questions her about is whether she actually told a doctor at the hospital in Joplin that she was actually the one that found Jayda and not Jaylen. She obviously denies this, and it's at this point where her story starts to change just a little bit. So she says that the kids went to bed around 8 or 8:15, and now she says that she spoke to a friend on the phone for about 5 minutes around 8:15. She then reiterates that Jaylen was the one that actually put them to bed. So this is obviously a small detail that if it did happen that night, it would be very easy to forget about. I'm not going to sit here and say that you should remember every single detail of something, of everything that happened that night when your child was hurt. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of that would be a blur for anybody. But I did think it was odd that she kind of added this in now after she's kind of established the bare bones, I guess, of her story. It just seems like she kind of threw that in there to be like, oh, I was busy a little bit later. It couldn't have been me, kind of. That's just my opinion, though. So then the detective says he wants to give Devin a few minutes to think about what happened and give her every opportunity to tell the truth. So it's at this point that I see a major shift in Devin's demeanor. Up until this point, she was pretty calm, pretty cooperative, just kind of trying to tell her story, and answer questions and everything like that, and just crying a little bit here and there, which I'm sure anybody would be crying trying to talk about this. It's at this point that she gets pretty agitated and hostile towards the detective, and she then asks for her dad to be called, which may not seem strange or important right now, but it will be important later. I will get into that here in a little bit. So at this point, the detective again gives her a little bit of pushback, and it's kind of like, what's that about? Like, why does your dad need to be called, kind of thing. And she says that she doesn't feel good about how things are going, and that the detective doesn't believe her, and that the statement, "I want to believe you," is the statement that's making her uncomfortable. And it's at this point that she says she's done talking to him. He then leaves her in the room alone for about 9 minutes. When he comes back, she's less annoyed with him, but still kind of agitated towards him, and she says that she has nothing else to tell him. At this point, the detective says that he hopes Jaylen will be honest with him, and then he goes on to ask about the bruising on Jayda's body, and when that started happening. She says they started dating in January, and the bruises started showing up in the spring or summer after. She then again reiterates that Jaylen has shown no indication that he did this, and that Jayda has never acted any different around him. So one thing I hadn't really mentioned up until this point was that before Jayda's death, she was having a lot of different symptoms going on with her. She was having seizures, she had the bruising, she had I think there were times where it was hard for her to sleep. She was nauseous, she was throwing up, just all kinds of things. And they had been taking her to the doctor a lot, leading up to her death, trying to figure out what was going on with her. So Devin says around the time that all of this started happening to Jayda, when she starts getting mysterious symptoms and kind of being sick and stuff, that she was spending a lot of time over at her father's house. So Devin's ex-boyfriend, I guess, Jada's father. And apparently there had been an incident there where one of his friends had a gun and the kids had to hide in the closet and some big dramatic thing. And after she tells the detective this, he says that these injuries actually started showing up when she was spending more time with Devin and Jaylen. So basically saying that these injuries and maybe even the sickness had nothing to do with what was going on at Mac's house. So I just thought it was strange that she brought that up at all. To me, it felt like she was trying to just point the finger at Mac instead of Jaylen, which doesn't make any sense, but I also just don't understand why she would have done that. I don't know what she thought that was gonna do. Like, I don't know how she thought that was gonna help or anything. Just given that her and Jaylen were the only two people in the house at the time that this happened to Jayda. So I don't know why she felt the need to bring up anything about Mac at all. I don't recall the detective ever asking her anything about Mac, at least not in that interrogation that I saw. So I just thought that was odd. Okay, so that's pretty much it for all the differences and things that I saw in Devin Kyle's interrogation that I wanted to point out. A couple of those things I will be revisiting here in just a little bit, but for right now, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the differences that I saw in Jaylen Vaden's interrogation. So like I said earlier, the bare bones or the basics of his story for what happened that night are basically the same as Devin's story. So they went to the Christmas program, came home, got in baths, got in bed, everything like that, and then Jaylen found her, came running into the bedroom. They called 911 and gave her CPR. One thing that he did mention that Devin didn't was that apparently Jayda was slurring her speech and was kind of pale in the face at the Christmas program. He also mentioned that they had a small fight. Him and Devin had a small fight before going home. Another thing he mentions is that when Jayda was getting into the tub after they got home, she started to slip and Jaylen caught her. And then this wasn't really a difference in story. I guess it was just more details if he was the one that found her. So he said that once the kids went to bed, he went in to check on Jayda, and she was laying on the ground face down, and he saw her laying on the floor and she took a breath in, but she never released the breath. He also says that she was stiff on the ground, but when he went to pick her up, she kind of went limp. And then this is where he says that he took her into the bedroom and they called 911 and he performed CPR on her. After going through the basics of his story of what he says happened that night, Jaylen says that he has no idea what happened to her. And so for a few minutes, they go back and forth, and basically the detective is trying to get more information out of him. But Jaylen pretty much just maintains that he has no idea what happened to her. Then about 25 minutes into the interview, the detective asked Jaylen something like, "So did you do this on purpose or was it an accident?" So this is where I see a big shift as far as details coming into play and Jaylen changing different parts of his story and that kind of stuff. So after the detective asked if it was on purpose or an accident, Jaylen says it was an accident. And he now says that they were playing around and he threw her on the bed. It's at this point the detective says that he is proud of Jaylen for making the right decision. Jaylen now says he went into her room when she was getting dressed and threw her on the bed and walked out. He says that she did not hit her head. The detective then corrects him and says, well, she did hit her head. Jaylen says that he threw her on the bed, but not on the floor. And it's at this point I see the detective applying a lot more pressure on Jaylen. He starts telling him that he's minimizing the situation and what he did. And Jaylen just keeps repeating the same story, that they were playing around and he threw her on the bed, but she didn't hit her head and he didn't throw her on the floor. The detective then starts saying things to Jalen to try to apply pressure to him and get more information out of him. And I think just try to like lower his confidence and make him a little bit more nervous. He starts off with, I can tell you that you knew instantly that you fucked up. He also tells him that they have it on lock. Another thing that the detective does throughout the entire interrogation is that he brings up the evidence that they have, just basically saying that they have this forensic evidence that proves that something had to have happened to her to cause her death that night. Which obviously is good. It's good enough evidence to like thoroughly investigate both of the adults that were home that night. But I don't think that they had any solid evidence pointing towards that this was Jalen. At least not that I saw. Other than maybe Devin, I guess, indicating that he could have done this, and her saying that she doesn't think that he wouldn't have had time to do this, even though she does say that he was only gone for a minute or two. So I guess if you want to take that as Devin indicating that he did this, then I guess that you could try to go with that lead, but I still wouldn't say that that's any kind of evidence. She never once said that she heard anything, saw anything, never once said that Jalen was ever violent towards them or anything like that. So obviously, yeah, they have that forensic evidence to say that she was hurt by someone that night, but they don't have anything saying that they know that that was Jalen, that it was Jalen that hurt her. So he keeps applying pressure to Jalen, and he keeps just like asking him to tell him the truth and tell him what really happened, as if his story basically is not good enough for him. He says other things like, think about how you look. I'm giving you an opportunity. And I know you already. He also tells him that he's hurting himself, I guess, by not confessing to this, and telling him that he made a bad decision and that he needs to tell him what happened. At one point, he even calls Jalen a monster for trying to save himself. So after the detective gets done applying all this pressure to Jalen, he finally says, "What made you so mad?" And I want to make a note that this is the first time that it is ever mentioned that Jalen became angry with Jayda or anything to that, like that. Jalen replies by saying, "I don't even remember," and then says maybe it was because she wasn't in bed. The detective then tells him that he did what he did and he made a bad mistake. He then says that he's telling lies and only cares about himself, and it makes him look bad. Jalen then says that he pulled her off the bed by her legs, told her to get dressed, and tossed her on the floor where she landed face first. The detective then asks what she hit her head on, and Jalen says it was the ground. The detective replies by saying that it wasn't, again correcting him. He then tells him that he's really trying here and that Jalen's not trying at all. He also says, "You're trying to save yourself," which is disgusting. The detective then says that he's going to give Jalen a minute to think about his story and that his judgment is clouded and that he's not making the right decision, and leaves the room. When the detective comes back, Jalen says that he came back and threw her down because she wasn't dressed. And at this point, even the detective is saying that the story isn't making sense. So Jalen's final statement on this is that he left and came back and threw her down because she wasn't dressed. He says that she was in front of the dresser before he threw her, and that she hit her head on the bed, and then he threw her on the floor, and he didn't clean anything up. The last thing that Jalen really says about this is that he just snapped. Okay, so now I want to get into some of my findings from my research and all of this, and also just my general opinions on, I guess, each interrogation, and I guess what I think was going on with this case. So in my opinion, at least compared to Jalen, I really feel like Devin was treated more like a witness or even like a victim in this case, which I understand to an extent because this is her biological child that passed away. and Jayda is not Jalen's biological child. So I understand that to some extent. But if these two people are the only adults in the house at the time that this happened, you have to treat them both like suspects. You can't just say, "Oh, well, we're gonna go with go with what one says," and kind of lean towards the other. Especially because there was no point when Devin ever said, "Oh yeah, I really feel like Jalen could have done this. I've seen him do this. I've seen him do that," or anything like that. Never once indicated that he could have done this. Even goes out of her way multiple times to say that she does not think he did this. He showed no indication that he did this. Jayda never acted different around him, nothing like that. One of the main things that the detective gave her some pushback on was her statements that she gave at Mercy Hospital in Joplin. So I did a little bit of research on this, and I was actually able to find some Carl Junction Police Department documents. In one of the documents, it said that Devin had actually told Dr. Michelle Pennell that she was the one who actually found Jayda unconscious. And it also said that one of her parents, either Carmen or Judd, corrected her by saying, "You mean he found her," referring to Jalen. Also in this set of documents, on December 5th, 2017, Dr. Paul N. Bauer was contacted and questioned about Devin and what she said happened that night. And he said that she changed her story. He said that he asked Devin about what happened that night with both of her parents, Carmen and Judd, present. She said that she put her to bed around 8 p.m. and then found her at 9 p.m. Carmen or Judd then interrupted her and said, "No, you didn't. Don't you remember?" Then Devin says, "Oh, that's right. My boyfriend found her." So I thought this was super important because that's not only one, but two doctors saying that she changed her story. And not only that she changed her story, but her parents interrupted her and corrected her on her story, which I think is extremely interesting considering that, well, at least on the body cam footage that I watched and the accounts of basically everyone there, Judd and Carmen were not present when this happened. I believe they met her at the hospital or something like that, but they were not in the home when this happened. So I just thought it was super interesting that two people who were not there could correct the story of someone who was there. Speaking of Devin's parents, I want to get into a little bit about who her parents are and why they're important to this story. So Devin's parents are Judd and Carmen McPherson. Judd is an extremely well-known and well-liked attorney in Joplin. He is so well-known that the only judge that was available to work the case was, and forgive me if I butcher your name, but Judge Michael Cordonnier, I believe is how you would say it. So he was assigned to the case by the Missouri Supreme Court because he was the only one in that circuit or in that group of people that said that they didn't know Judd McPherson. Some of the sources that I found during my research said that Judd either tried to or did actually intervene with the investigation. I was able to find a document that said, or that talked about what happened to Jayda, and whoever wrote the document ended it by saying that the visits between Quincy, Devin's other child, and her parents and Devin should still be supervised. In this document, the author also says that Judd contacted them to tell them that what happened to Jayda was just a medical thing. But Dr. Michelle Pennell, the same doctor that said that Devin changed her story, said that she had already told the family that this was a suspected non-accidental head trauma. Also in this document, it said on November 30th, 2017, the family was notified about the custody situation. And when Judd found out about the situation, he asked who the judge was that signed the order, and he said he would be getting that changed, and then he hung up the phone. One thing that they did note also in this document that I thought was very, very interesting, very strange, and very important is that the family, no one, not a single person in the family on Devin Kyle's side, asked about the abuse or what happened to Jayda. Speaking of the abuse, there are rumors that Devin was actually the one abusing Jayda while Jalen was at work. They actually do mention the random bruising in Devin's interrogation, and it basically just gets pinned on Jaylen because he was there when it started happening, so they pinned it on him. Another big thing that was circulating around social media and stuff like that is some text messages between Devin and Jaylen before Jayda's death. There were some where she was just saying things like, oh, like they're bothering her and they're driving her insane because they keep fighting with each other. But at one point, Jaylen does tell her that she's scaring him when she's talking about like the kids driving her crazy and everything like that. At another point, she does say, I want to throw her across the room, referring to Jayda. And this was because Jayda had been crying for no apparent reason, and she couldn't handle it because she had no explanation for it. Which, like, I understand, but, like, if there's a lot going on with your kid, such as seizures, vomiting, and all of the stuff that they listed off, I mean, maybe there is something wrong with her, but you just don't know what it is. You know, like, there could be something really wrong with her. Jaylen replies to this by saying she cannot throw the kids across the room or throw Jayda across the room, and he follows it up with 2 laughing emojis. So when I saw that, that just made me think, you know, maybe she's just venting and maybe she's being a little bit dramatic and she wouldn't actually do anything like that to her kids, because people say crazy shit all the time. You know what I mean? People say that they would do stuff if they're gonna do stuff that they would never ever do. So maybe she was just venting, right? But I also think it's very suspicious that that's the exact way that the police think that Jayda died, is basically being thrown around a room and causing head trauma. By the time I got done looking into all this information about Devin and her family, I was just left really confused and with a lot of questions, because if Devin is innocent, there's just so many things that still don't make sense. Like, if she wasn't the one that did anything to Jayda to cause her death, then it had to be Jaylen, right? So if Jaylen was the one that did this, how did she not hear anything or know anything at all about it? Also, in her interrogation, she says that she wouldn't say that he didn't have time to do this since they weren't in the same room the entire time. But then she also says that he's only gone from the bedroom for about a minute or two before he runs back in holding her. So if he's only gone for about a minute or two, how does he have time to throw your child around the room and then you don't hear anything? Also, in the beginning of her interrogation, Devin is the one who says that she's the one who put Jayda in her pajamas. So I don't understand how, if Devin put her in her pajamas, why would Jaylen be angry at her and throw her around the room for not wearing the correct ones? And if Jaylen did do something to her and she did hear Jaylen do something to Jayda, where are her charges for lying to the police and protecting Jaylen? And again, I just don't understand why she wasn't treated with the same pressure and suspicion that Jaylen was, because even though she is her mother, she is still a suspect in the case. She's one of the only 2 adults that were in the house. So I just don't understand why she was treated so differently compared to him. And finally, if Judd did try to intervene in this investigation, why did he feel the need to do that? After his interrogation, Jaylen was handcuffed and taken into custody. In early January of 2019, he took a plea deal that sentenced him to serve at least 80% of a 22-year sentence. I feel like this was one big thing that made people really think that he did do it. I think a lot of people think that, oh, if you take a plea deal, then you obviously did it because you're basically admitting that you did it, so you get a lesser charge. So I understand, but I feel like people don't understand that it's not uncommon for someone to be convicted based off of a false confession or a coerced confession. And also, like Jaylen said in one of his letters to either a family member or one of his friends, he said, "I'm scared of going to trial because they'll stack a life sentence on my head and I'll never come home." And I definitely understand his perspective on that, because going to trial could have proved his innocence, but it also could have just put him in a worse position than he was already in. So I definitely get where he's coming from, and I get the kind of anxiety, like, that, you know, I mean, I don't understand, but I could imagine what kind of anxiety that could cause you. So I would understand why someone might want to take a deal over going to trial and going through that whole process. Jaylen has since sent many letters and notes to family members and friends from prison, and he has said that he felt very pressured by the detective, and he would not have been able to live with himself if he would have actually done this. He also accuses Judd of lying, and he says that he is getting burned for being loyal to the wrong people, and he knows it was stupid trying to protect them and thinking they really had his back, but he loves hard and he rides no matter what. One of the most pivotal points in his entire interrogation, I think, is when the detective asks him, "So did you do this on purpose or was it an accident?" And Jaylen then says that it was an accident. I think this is such a big and an important moment in his interrogation, because up until this point, he has said that he has no idea what happened to her, hasn't said anything about him ever harming her or any of the other children or Devin or anything. And I think the detective, in a sense, kind of backed him into a wall by giving him a choice. Like, rather than being like, "Did you do this?" He was like, "So you did this. So was it an accident or did you do it on purpose?" You know, like, he wasn't trying to establish if he did this at all. He was acting as if he knew he did this. He just didn't know if he purposely killed Jayda or if it was an accident. It's also from this point on where Jaylen's story starts to change, and he starts to add in these details that the detective is looking for, like, you know, where did she hit her head, or what did she hit her head on, you know, stuff like that. And I feel like the detective really fed that to him and was asking him for those details and trying to pull those details out of him. You can go and watch the interrogation yourself. You may feel differently. That's just kind of how I felt about it. Around this time is also where the detective starts applying pressure and tells him that he's minimizing what he did in the situation, and he's trying to protect himself, and that he's a monster and all this stuff. And I feel like that was also something that Devin was not subjected to whatsoever. He never once told her that she was minimizing her story or minimizing what happened that night, or that she was trying just to protect herself and that made her a monster. I just feel like it just applies so much pressure to you, and I think anyone would feel backed into a corner if someone was coming at you with that kind of language and that kind of attitude. Even if you didn't do something, I mean, I feel like you may feel like you need to tell them that you did, just to kind of get out of the situation. Also, in his interrogation, Jaylen is asked about drug use and alcohol use and whether he's ever inappropriately touched any of the children. Devin is never asked about either of these things, as far as I can recall. Maybe about the drug and alcohol use, but I think he really only asked her about Jaylen's drug and alcohol use. I could be wrong. But she's definitely not asked about ever inappropriately touching the kids or anything like that. Also, one huge thing that I noticed in his interrogation, was that he was never once asked about what kind of parent Devin was. And I think that's super important, because I mean, it may be a touchy subject. Maybe the detective feels like he doesn't want to disrespect her as a mother or whatever, but I think it's super important to know what Devin is like as a parent, because she's not the only suspect here. Jaylen is not the only suspect here. She's also a suspect, so she needs to be looked at thoroughly too, and not just Jaylen. Throughout my research and my investigation of this case, I just really felt like that it's possible that Jaylen could have been covering for Devin. I'm not sure if that's true or not. That's just kind of how I felt about it. Whether he was or not, he really was never given any kind of opportunity to possibly maybe tell the truth about Devin and what kind of parent she was or what kind of person she was. He was never questioned about her at all. Since being arrested, Jaylen is now being housed at the Jefferson City Correctional Center in Jefferson City, Missouri. To wrap up this episode, I just want to give some final opinions and feelings about this case and kind of how I think we got to this outcome. Obviously, I feel like Devin would have been treated differently in the interrogations. than Jaylen, given that she is a white female and he is a black male. Obviously, I think they would have been treated differently, regardless to her being the biological mother of Jayda and him not being the biological father of Jayda. And also regardless to Devin being related to a well-known and well-liked attorney. But I definitely think that her father's image and position could have definitely greatly helped her in this case. Another big thing, like I said, is that Devin is Jayda's biological mother, and I think that also could have helped her in this case, because I think sometimes it's a lot easier for us to think of men as more aggressive in like the relationship or in the household. And I think it's much easier to accept that maybe a live-in boyfriend of a mother of two may have killed or hurt one of the children rather than the mother herself. I think it's very difficult sometimes for society to wrap their brains around a mother hurting their child, which is understandable. Obviously, it's a horrific thing to think about, but it is something that happens. And unfortunately, I also think it's much easier for society to picture a black male as a more aggressive person rather than a white female, which again always isn't always the case. There are many, many cases of mothers who choose to kill their children for many different reasons. It happens pretty often, unfortunately. So I just think sometimes we have to open our minds a little bit and think about it in a different frame of reference, I guess, because even though that's something that's harder to think about and something we want to think doesn't happen, it does happen. And I don't think that if Devin is guilty of this, I don't think that we should just turn a blind eye to what she could have been doing to Jayda and everything like that just because of who she was to her and what she looks like. I don't think that makes any difference. She's still one of the two adults home at the time that this happened. So I still think that she should have been more thoroughly investigated. I just think Devin was protected by a wall of privilege for many different reasons. And I think all of the aspects of this case that worked in Devin's favor actually hurt Jaylen. So I just think it's a really complicated situation and a really like difficult case for some people to really think about, I think, in the way that it needs to be, so that you might be able to try to get to the bottom of it. I also feel like it really just could have been more convenient for all of this to be blamed on Jaylen. Just like it could have been easier for us all, or for a lot of people to think that he was the one that did this. So obviously I can't say whether I know either one of them is innocent or guilty. But the way that this case panned out just did not sit right with me. It just doesn't feel right, and obviously I could be wrong. Maybe it did go the way that it needed to go. But I just don't think that it did. And I definitely think that it could have been more thoroughly investigated. Not only so, we could get to the bottom of this, but also because at the end of the day, there's a little 3-year-old girl who's gone now, and I think that she deserves justice, and I think that the person who did this to her deserves to serve the time for it, or to serve the punishment for it. And maybe that is Jaylen, but I'm just saying that the investigation that was done does not prove to me 100% without a doubt that it was Jaylen. If it does to you, that's fine. Everyone has their own opinion. But for me, it just didn't sit right with me. It doesn't feel right. It just doesn't. And also, if Jaylen is innocent of this, I mean, he may spend the rest of his life trying to adjust to the outside world when he does get out, and just rehabilitate himself from what he had to deal with in jail. And also if he is innocent, having to defend his innocence maybe to a lot of different people who may think that he killed a child. At the end of the day, what happened to Jayda is just so tragic and sad, and I just really wish that her story could have had a different ending. I wish that she was still here on this earth with us. And I hope that maybe one day we will actually get to the bottom of this and be able to say without a doubt who did this to her. I think at the very least she deserves that. All right, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I think that is all that I have for you for this episode. One last thing I do want to say before I go is that if you have a case that you want me to cover or research here, and cover it here on the podcast or on the blog or anything like that, please feel free to shoot me an email or find me on social media and private message me about it. If you're looking for me anywhere, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you want to email me, it's just the Black Sheep Tribune all over social media, and then my email is theblacksheeptribune@gmail.com. So yeah, thank you all so much for stopping by, and please come back and visit soon to hear about the next Black Sheep Tribune case.